This is the week 1 lecture for our Human Resources Management class. HR Management, Human Resources Management, sometimes I'll call it HRM. This is your HR strategy, your deliberate use of personnel to help gain or maintain a competitive advantage in the market. Your people are your largest intangible resource in a company. How you choose to hire, manage, discipline, and develop them can really make or break your company. HR is equal parts compliance and strategy in most companies. We have to comply with the laws and regulations from our nation, our state, our city, our industry, and other governing bodies. We also have to make sure that we're being strategic in how we're using our people. And HR is one of the few horizontal departments in most companies. If you think about the department overview, the organizational structure of a company, it's usually vertical. You've got your sales department, your marketing department, your manufacturing department. HR goes across all of them because they're the folks that are hiring for all those departments. They're the folks doing the performance review for all of those departments. So they need to understand a broad cross-section of what the company is doing. And this last bullet here talks about a good number of the tasks that HR is responsible for in any given company. When you normally talk about human resources, you'll think of payroll, benefits, but are you thinking about your diversity, your safety, your record keeping? Some of these in your companies that you've worked for or that you're familiar with are handled by other departments, but they are HR roles. Whether or not they're housed in human resources in your company may vary. As I said earlier, intangible resources that HR is responsible for are your employees, your culture, and your brand. These align with your strategic planning. If you want your culture to be innovative and creative, then you need to hire and pay people for those traits. If you tell your employees you want them to be innovative, you want to be creative and create change, and on their performance review and what they're paid for is to do things the way they've always been done, guess what? Your culture doesn't match what your strategy is. That's why this last bullet says a seat at the table. If leadership of a company is trying to do a change, they have to bring in human resources and understand what they're asking for from their employees before they can try to make a strategic decision if they really want to be successful in implementing any kind of change. So what are some of the trends that have been happening in human resources? At-will employment, changes in labor unions overall have been a really big change. The states are changing the way employees can recruit and the way people can join or not join a labor union. Generations in the workforce, we're starting to get to the tail end of this. We, for a while, had 4 generations in the workplace with the traditionalists, the baby boomers. The baby boomers are folks born from 1946 to 1964. The Generation X, which is 1965 to 1980. Generation Y, which is 1980 to 1991, depending on which sources you're looking at. The millennials are also known as Generation Y, in case you were wondering where you fell into that. And now we're starting to get into Generation 2020, Generation Z. These are the folks that are just now 18. More likely, they're still in their early teens, and they'll be coming into the workforce. Each generation brings with them a set of ideals, what work has a purpose to do. For example, the baby boomers have a job so they can have a family. They're not tied up with the titles and the brand and that sort of thing. They go to work so they can go home. Generation Millennial cares more about the title. They're more inclined to want their work to interact with their life in some way. And HR needs to know these things because we need to know how to engage different age groups. Maybe we want one generation over another for a particular company needs. A new trend is honesty and transparency. obviously we've always hoped that our human resource folks are honesty, but now we want transparency. We want to know exactly what they're doing, why they're doing it, and show us all the paperwork. We also have seen recently in HR that younger workers don't care about staying at a company for any length of time. They saw the Great Recession and how many people were laid off that were loyal to those companies. So why should I be loyal to that company if they're not loyal to me? So we went from a retention of roughly 10 years on average for baby boomers to 3 years with millennials. So how are we coping with that? Do we care? What are we asking for of our employees? These are all things that HR needs to understand with how folks view their relationship with their employer and how long they want to stay there. Social media, branding, these two kind of go together. Obviously, as this is a new technology, HR has to be on top of it. And the main reason HR is with social media is this obviously is going to be usually sales and marketing, but if you are looking for a job, you will usually look at a company's Facebook page or their LinkedIn profile to get an idea of who they are as a company. So that's why HR needs to be involved with branding and social media. And the last one is diversity, which as a trend, it may kind of feel out of place for you. It is a law. We have to comply. There are legal aspects to diversity, but it goes beyond what the law requires in terms of what companies are trying to do with diversity of both external and internal diversity. It really is a trend in and above what the law requires. So those are a few trends. I gave you more in our reading, and I also would ask you to do a search and see what you can find in human resources and employment trends, because these are from 14 and 15 and they are all still happening, but there are new trends out there and I'm curious how many of them you guys can find for your discussion prompt. This is a very long, detailed history of human resources. The first human resources type event that happened was in 1115 BC when China first started screening applicants. If you think about before that, you either worked for your family or you worked for your neighbor. There wasn't, tell me about what kind of work you've done. I don't know you. Give me some background. You knew the people that you worked with and for. They were either your kings, your landlords, your feudal lords, like I said earlier, your neighbor, your father. And we were working in very small areas. If you commuted, it was someplace that you could walk or ride your horse. There, you knew everybody. In the Industrial Revolution, we started getting management level where we had workers and then we had folks telling what the workers should be doing. We got unions, but not like we think of them today. A labor union in 1790s were folks that were taking care of the employees, meaning that when the management did something that today is completely illegal, immoral, the labor unions would, for lack of a better term, beat them up. They would take their force to the people, and through threat, they would give the employees power. You can't do this. We're standing up as a group. And usually it was physical intimidation. In 1913, the Department of Labor was formed. And in 1935, we put laws about what unions and companies could do, and it got much more civilized, and we started getting the unions that we have today, that when they're fighting for the employees, they're not literally fighting for their employees anymore, which is really nice. The Hawthorne studies in the 1920s and 30s, they were looking to see if how much you like your job impacts how well you do your job. I've always found it really interesting that it wasn't until the 1930s that someone thought to ask if they like their job, will they work harder? Because now it's a given. Employee engagement is a huge trend. We know about it. We study it. It just boggles my mind that we didn't think to ask the question until the 30s. We put together a whole slew of laws in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. You can see the big ones here that HR has to comply with every day. And some of the surprising late adds. We didn't get the Americans with Disabilities Act until 1990. People are usually very shocked by that. They think we've been protecting our Americans with disabilities much much longer than that, and we haven't. It's really only been, now 30 years. So that last slide was the national laws. Wisconsin has more specific HR laws. We have a minimum wage law. You can't pay employees less than $7.25 unless they're a waitress, or other caveats that we can make. There are obviously more laws than just that one. I just chose one to highlight an HR-specific law. Then there are industry-specific laws. For example, in engineering, for you to get your professional engineer, your PE designation, there are certain things you have to do for it to be allowed. You could call this a regulation, but for some industries, they're legally required. Nurses, you need an RN licensure to call yourself a registered nurse. A law versus a culture. Some places, some employers will ask you to have certain professional designations that aren't legally required. They just want you to have them. For example, in a hospital setting, is your doctor board certified? It's not legally required, but it's a good idea, and the company might require it to work there. So it's not legally required in the country, city, state, but if you want to work at Wheaton Franciscan or Freighter or whoever else requires board certification, then that's their culture. And this is sometimes a sticking point for people. They don't understand the difference between the legal requirements and the company requirements. And honestly, if you're working there, for all intent and purposes, it doesn't matter. They're the same. So HR has a lot of perceptions from folks that don't work in HR. If you stop and think about, well, who is HR in my company? You probably think a couple of different things. You think they're the folks that do our paperwork. They're the clerical model. All they do is file my hiring paperwork, they file my benefits paperwork, and they basically are just human filing cabinets. Then there's the counseling model. They're the ones that are your manager and your employee are having a dispute about what happened and who should be fired and who's to blame, and HR is in there counseling. And they're the ones that are helping you through discipline activities. And the whole point of them being there is just to help people with their feelings and working through disputes. The third model is one that's much more common here in the Midwest. It's the industrial relations model. So if you have a heavy union shop, this is where you think of this model. All they do is handle the labor contracts. Because with the union, HR isn't driving strategy. They are implementing union strategy. So all they need to do is how to negotiate and how to work contracts. The control model is, I have to ask HR if we're allowed to do that. If that's what you think of when you think of HR, is they're the folks that tell us yes or no if we can do something, then you have a control model. You have policies and procedures that everything is guided by HR, if they're allowed to do that, if they're not allowed to do that. And the last model is the consulting model. This is the newest model where the HR department acts as a business partner. You only use them when you need them. I'm trying to implement a change. Can you help me work through that? It's performance review time. Can you come in and help me finish my performance reviews? And they really are there to help you when you need it, and they're not there when you don't need them. And if you think about your employer or an employer you're familiar with, you probably have one of these mental models for what they do. They're either the paperwork people, the people that tell you no, or they're the folks that help you when you need it. These are all true in some aspects, and they're okay. But what the other perception that isn't here is they're where you go when you get in trouble. And that was always the funny part to me in HR. If you told somebody to come visit you in HR, they were always so nervous and they were sweating and, oh my gosh, I must be in trouble if I'm in HR. And the principal's office model is what I call that. And that is a large perception of human resources, is they're only brought in when you're in trouble. And I hate to say it, but that's not true. We do a lot more in human resources than get you in trouble. And honestly, it's usually less than 10% of any workday is disciplinary and employee management concerns. But that's what people think of us. So human resources, as I said earlier, is one of the few horizontal departments, so they do have to work with all of these other departments in some ways. Legal is probably the department they work with the most because as they're writing policies, procedures, handbooks, they have to make sure they're abiding by all the laws. Their sales and marketing team, we talked about that a little earlier in the trends slide. They have to make sure that they're not saying anything that's going to hurt the employee morale or make it harder to recruit. If your company is making marks that are hurting you socially, it's going to be harder to find new employees. Business lines, accounting, finance, they have to know a little bit about what all these companies are doing to be able to hire for them. Accounting and finance tells them how much we can pay folks. And then training and development is actually a department of human resources, but the current trend is to split it out and have a corporate university where they may report up to human resources at the highest levels, but they operate as their own department very often now. So training and development, they need to know what HR is asking for in their hiring, in their performance reviews, and they need to know how to train and develop employees to get them to the next level of management, to get them to proficient on their review, to get them to be compliant with all the legal regulations that are coming out. HR and training need to work very closely together. They need to make sure that training and development isn't training them for things that HR isn't paying them for. If we ask our employee to do A, B, and C, and you keep training them on D and F, why are they learning that if that's not part of their job description? So those are some of the ways that HR interacts with other departments. HR has a lot of challenges that they need to work through. Environmental challenges can be internal environment, meaning the company culture, the chairs, the building is smelly or drafty or moldy or whatever, and it can be external environment. What is happening in our state, in our country, with our society? Do we need to understand the way the parent-family dynamic is changing? If they legalize gay marriage, do I need to offer benefits to their spouses? If they adopt a child, do I have to give them maternity leave? These are environmental challenges because the environment is changing. The legal environment, the cultural environment, the socio-economical environment, the technical environment. We need to understand all these things in human resources to make sure that we're not out of touch. You can see the internet, the second one. That was a big deal. How are we going to bring in the internet? Now all companies have the internet. How are we bringing in other folks' devices? Are we going to let them bring their own device and risk that shortage? Are we going to give them technology and risk that? We have to understand the environment to make sure that we are guiding our employees correctly. We also have organizational challenges in, do we understand how our company is run so we can make sure that we are making our employees as successful as they can be. We need to know what we should be outsourcing, which is human resources is a really bad word because it means we have to lay off our employees and give the work to other folks. But maybe by keeping that work in-house, we're hurting our brand. So this is a huge decision on outsourcing from an organizational perspective, and human resources is right in the middle of it. Should we have this team reporting to that department or another department? What makes more sense? How are we protecting our intellectual property? What do we tell our employees about what's confidential and what can they share? So we're not losing our competitive advantage because we didn't know to protect ourselves. So all of these things human resources is thinking through as they're setting policy and hiring and strategy decisions. Then we get down to the individual person. How do we know if the person that we're interviewing is the same person that's going to show up to work? Because we all know that when we interview, we're putting our best face forward. Are we doing a good job matching our people to our organization? How are we doing with ethics on a personal level? How are we measuring productivity, brain drain? As our baby boomers start retiring, they're going to take tons of knowledge with them. We need to make sure that we understand our employees on an individual level, which is a huge challenge, especially the bigger your company gets. My last company, we had 16,000 employees. I think I knew 1,000 of them, but I was making decisions for all of them. So how do I do that on the individual level, making sure I'm hitting organizational goals? So you can see the levels of challenges that HR has to come up with, ways to meet them, or ignore them if we just don't have the bandwidth or the priorities for that specific challenge. Knowing all of those challenges, knowing all the requirements that we have to meet, we have to come up with strategy. It should align with our organizational strategy. Again, if the corporate leaders create a strategy and then hand it to human resources has to retrofit a strategy that works. Hopefully, you had a CHRO, a Chief Human Resources Officer, at the meeting that was speaking for employees and from an HR point of view. But either way, we come up with a strategy. Either we were at the table or we formed an ad hoc strategy afterwards. We need to understand how the work is done in an organization and who does what. So how is the work flowing? There's usually a process chart and a flow chart so we can see the way that the work is going. If we think of the business units as mini businesses, we can come up with some really unique strategies. Maybe manufacturing needs to be more differentiated. Maybe sales needs to be more cost effective. And we can come up with strategies so we can put the training in place so we can hire better, and all of those dominoes can just be lined up. But we have to have an organizational strategy and goals to match our HR goals too. So one of the strategies that is most common is the Porter strategy. And do we want to go cost leadership? Do we want to go differentiation? Do we want to go focus? These are business strategies. So this is the way a company decides who they're going after from a market point of view, from a customer point of view, and HR should match that. So a cost leadership strategy, Briggs & Stratton, they do not pay their employees top market because they're cost leadership. The whole point of their brand is cost savings. So if they start paying their employees top market, they're not staying with their strategy. With differentiation, they're marketing the fact that they're different from other people. So they try to hire folks that are different from other people. So in the interview with Caterpillar, you get asked a lot of questions on how are you different from every other engineer out there? What is an innovation or a creative way you've used to solve a problem? Because they're trying to follow their business strategy with their human resource strategy. And a focus strategy is where you have a small niche market and you need experts. You are going after that market either through low cost or differentiation, or just you are the best at that particular small area. And you hire folks again to match that strategy. So hopefully that makes sense on how we would make strategy and then the tools we would use to make sure that our strategy in human resources is aligned with our business strategy. How many of you had thought of those things? Or now that you're thinking of them, does your company do that? Do you know your company strategy? And does it seem to make sense that they're hiring along those lines? Hopefully your answer there is yes. And you can see how these things should align in a company to really have cohesion across all business units. As I stated earlier, human resources has to be aware of technology. Not only do they have to be aware of it, but there are a few technologies that HR uses that are crucial for success and efficiency and effectiveness. So an HRIS system is our analytics. We are using it for all of the menial, repetitive functions that we used to have to pay a person to do. We used to have to clock in on the time card and turn our time cards in, and then Sally in payroll would add up your time card and calculate all of that for you. Now it's all automated. You clock in, it's going into the computer system, everything's there, they know how much you're getting paid, they can see how many hours, it's all automated. And then we can pull analytics to see how much overtime did we have, how much are people hitting their break times correctly, and they can see all these different things. You can see those three brands, SAP, Kronos, and ADP. These are systems that companies buy to do this for them. And they hopefully integrate with their LMS system, their learning management system. And if you notice that first bullet, Blackboard is the largest LMS system in the United States. And we use this to do our training and development. So if the two systems talk to each other, the HRIS system would say, well, it looks like Trina has been she's been consistently coming in 10 minutes late, but her breaks are 10 minutes short. We should put her in a training on the ethics of being on time. And they just trigger that in their SAP or Skillsoft. And it pops up in my email that I now have a required training on whatever I just said, ethics and payroll. And it's all automated. So they're giving training based on something that they pulled out of the system, and they're freeing up their time to do the strategy and not so much the minutia and training. You can see how the different software applications work together. Core HR is going to be your SAP program. Sometimes you'll outsource this. Aon Hewitt in Chicago is a big company that does this, as is ADP and SAP. And those are going to be a mix of outsourced and in-house solutions. Workforce management, how are you scheduling your employees? How are you tracking their timesheets, their attendance, that sort of thing? That may be another software. It may be part of the core HR software. And then the last one is strategic HR. So if you're a small company, you might only have that first dark blue column. Maybe you get into the second column of software and you're not having folks do this by hand. And then the last one is really going to be a more sophisticated company, or they're outsourcing it, or they're a larger company. So your applicant tracking system is your brass ring. SAP has a version. This is where you fill out your application online, and it's all automated. Even the initial screening, before it ever gets to a human, 80 to 90% of the applicants are weeded out before they even are seen by a human. Performance reviews, the manager does them. They're submitted to HR. If it is completed correctly, it's all automated. And the same thing with learning management. It's all automated. I get an email, hey, it's been a year since you took your sexual harassment training. It's now required again. Those sorts of things. That's HR technology from a really high level. And this is a huge trend of the changes and nuances in human resources technology. So I have a little activity. Obviously, you guys are by yourself, but I want you to mentally designate yourself. If you are shorter than 5.5 feet, if you are taller than 5.5 feet, or if you are exactly 5.5 feet, I want you to mentally put yourself in one of these three buckets. Now, if I tell you, hopefully you knew how tall you were and you did that pretty quickly. If I tell you if you're taller than 5'6", you can apply for this job. Everyone else, thank you. You cannot apply for this job. Did I just illegally discriminate? Maybe. So the reason is, we're going to get to that. But what I wanted to point out here is this is a completely arbitrary number until I explain Title VII. So hold that thought of where you stood. Are you under 5'6" and not allowed to apply, or are you 5'6" or above and you can't apply to a job? Okay, so equal opportunity is a huge compliance issue for companies. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 requires women get the same pay as men who did the same job in the same company. Hopefully that just caught your ear that I said 1963 and equal pay, which is why I have been laughing hysterically as politicians are like, we need equal pay for equal work. It's legally required. It has been since the 60s. And the numbers that they're comparing are apples and oranges. If you have two people doing the same job at the same company and they're not getting paid the same amount, you can sue them under the Equal Pay Act of 1963. But they're politicians, so they're spinning some nice stuff. It's amusing. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is what we will be paying attention to, okay? We are only paying attention to Title VII because that's what applies to employment. The other titles are you can get married, you can eat at a restaurant, all the other things the civil rights covered to make it fair and equal. This Title VII, though you're going to hear me call it just Title VII, I am referring to the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's a mouthful, so I'm just going to say Title VII. This is your protection against discrimination based on race, color, creed, national origin, those different criterias. And it gives us a couple of definitions. Discrimination, the way we use it talking to each other, is not actually correct, because discrimination just means making distinctions, where I just said, if you're above 5'6", put yourself in this bucket. If you're below 5'6", put yourself in that bucket. That's discriminating from a technical point of view. Here's where we think of discrimination. Disparate treatment. Discrimination that occurs when people are treated differently because of their membership in the protected class. So when I just had you students in two buckets, below 5'6", above 5'6", that's discrimination. We think of discrimination as the next step, where now I'm treating you guys differently. And that's normally what we're thinking of when we say discrimination, but that's disparate treatment. Now I'm treating the folks above 5'6", they get to apply for this job. The folks below 5'6", nope, you guys don't. It's not allowed. Obviously, we know that we know that we're not allowed to discriminate for groups, but we are, and here's why. The adverse impact is discrimination that occurs when equal application of a standard has unequal effects on protected classes. So if I tell you you have to be at least 5'6" to be a pilot for a commercial airline, because if you're not, you can't touch all the machines and it's a safety hazard, I'm allowed to discriminate and do disparate treatment. But I have an adverse impact on women, Asian, and certain other groups because we're naturally short. So there's a larger percentage of the population that's adversely impacted by my seemingly random number. I'm allowed to discriminate based on height because it's a safety concern. I can discriminate in other ways if it is a job requirement that impacts safety or has other considerations. So there are loopholes to Title VII, but you can't say, I'm not hiring you because you're African American. I'm not hiring you because you're a man. These are illegal, and we know this. It's Title VII. We've known it for years. We are now trying to get sexual orientation, gender identity added into the Civil Rights Act. Right now, it is technically at the national legal level still legal to discriminate based on sexual orientation. It is not one of the protected categories under Title VII. Being as this class is about human resources, we are protecting the company from employee lawsuits. So we need to understand how to defend against discrimination charges. It is very, very, very easy for somebody to say they were discriminated against. The only thing they have to do is say, I interviewed for a job and I wasn't chosen. I think I was discriminated against. The company then has the onus to prove that they did not discriminate. That's it. All the employee has to say is, I wasn't hired. I think I was discriminated against. They don't have to have a reason. They don't have to have proof. The company has to provide proof that they did not do it. And it is very hard to prove what you did not do. So we have four main corporate defenses for discrimination. And I'm going to caveat this with, hopefully we are not covering ourselves and doing illegal things. Hopefully this is, we were doing the right thing and the person is bringing a false claim. That was my caveat. So we can show job relatedness. We did not hire Mark because he only had 2 years of service and we were looking for 5 years of service and his skills weren't job related. We can document that through the interview and the application. Basically, we're showing you weren't as strong of a candidate as this other person, and we can show that objectively. We have the data. So the next one is we have bona fide occupational qualifications. You're 67, you're not allowed to be older than 62 and be a commercial pilot. Sorry. So yes, we did age discriminate, but your vision deteriorates so quickly after the age of 62. We've shown that it's a security risk, and we now have a legal loophole to discriminate against you based on a specific physical attribute or age attribute. We did not promote you because we used seniority. Yes, you were better at the job, but we have to choose the person that's been here longer. If you use seniority, you have to prove that your company always uses seniority. We didn't just do it for this one promotion. We do it all the time. So if your company doesn't always use seniority, you can't use this requirement. And then the last one was a business necessity. People will say they were discriminated against because of a drug testing policy, and it's commonly known that minorities get discipline charges for drug testing more than whites. So I was discriminated because they chose me to be drug tested. Not because I was positive. That's not what they're fighting. They're fighting that you selected me because of my race to be drug tested. And the drug testing policy is clear. Everyone gets drug tested once a quarter. We drug test for hiring anybody. Random drug tests are chosen by a computer system and has absolutely no human interaction at all. Race isn't even factored in. It's alphabetical random. We can show the business necessity for drug testing policy because we're using heavy machinery, and if you're stoned, you're going to kill somebody. So that's our policy. It's required. Here's how we can show it was a business necessity for us to do this. We were not discriminating against you because of your race, because of your illness, because drug addiction can be classified as an illness in some states. So these are the big 4 ways that we will defend ourselves against false discrimination charges. The theme, if you did not pick it up, is you better have paperwork and documentation for everything you do with your employees when it comes to hiring them, firing them, promoting them, reviewing them. You need to have clear paper trails that you keep on file in case of. So what does employee equality mean? How do we want fairness? Hopefully we do want fairness. That's a big caveat. Hopefully we do want a fair employee environment. Fair employment is the goal of the equal opportunity legislation I was just speaking of. Employment decisions are not made on illegal discrimination ideas. Affirmative action is encouraging hiring of groups that were discriminated against in the past. So that would be African Americans, Native Americans, women, and Vietnam vets. We want you to give those qualities weight when you make your decision. Fair employment says don't look at their gender, don't look at their race, don't look at their age, pick the best candidate. The best candidate should win. Both have the same goal of fair employment. One says look at nothing, the other says give weight. So which is better? Do we give weight to the folks that have had a rougher past, historically speaking, from 40 and 50 years ago, and give them weight? We need to consider affirmative action. Or do we try to scrub all of it and just choose the best applicant? There's no answer that I'm going to give you to this question because I don't want to answer it. If you are a public institution or have government contracts, you have to use affirmative action. The government's mandated it. That's my only comment between which is better, which is more ethical, fair employment or affirmative action. These both are trying to get an equal opportunity, fair workplace. They just go about it in 2 very different ways. So again, we as HR are trying to protect the employer, because if we don't protect the employer and we go out of business, we can't protect the employee. So how do we really reduce liability? We establish written policies. We make sure to tell the managers what they are and are not allowed to ask about when they're hiring. We tell them what they are and are not allowed to consider in hiring. We communicate and train on the policies. We make sure that all employees know our stance on equal opportunity, diversity, affirmative action. We make sure that we have effective complaint procedures. So if somebody is feeling like they're discriminated against, we can fix it internally and quickly. We quickly investigate and document all claims. There again, documentation. Paperwork protects the company. We want to take remedial action to correct past issues. You do not want to keep giving your manager that keeps messing up on this front little slaps on the wrist with no real penalty. That's how you get brought to external lawsuits. You have reputation issues. You have internal engagement issues. You do not want to let things go. You want to stop it. You make sure the complainant does not end up in a less desirable position if he or she needs to be transferred, because sometimes the solution is getting Bob and Mary away from each other. That is truly the best way to do it. But you need to make sure that whoever complained doesn't feel that their new place is less desirable. And then follow up to prevent continued problems or retaliation. You need to make sure that you're following up, you're preventing things, and you are documenting it. I think I've said documentation now about 13 times in the last 2 slides. You have to document everything. Everything. The Civil Rights Act of 1991 intensified the Title VII. They brought the burden of proof to companies. It used to be the employee had to prove, or the person who wanted to be an employee had to prove that they were discriminated against, which was very hard for them because they couldn't even see the other candidates. So now, as of 1991, the burden is on the companies. It also extended what a suing person could ask for. They can now get jury trials, and they can ask for punitive and compensatory damages. So not just back pay. So you didn't promote me. I should have been promoted. You owe me the 6 months of promotion pay that I should have received. And they would give you whatever, your couple $1,000s. Now they can punish the defendant. So this is when you see Walmart got sued for not promoting women and got sued for $25 million. That wasn't back pay. That was, we're punishing you, Walmart, for not promoting women. And then compensatory damages are to compensate for financial or psychological harm the plaintiffs have suffered. And I was so upset from being discriminated against because I'm old or a girl or this race or whatever. I need another $5 million. We're now allowed to award all of that to plaintiffs that win a crime. So 1991 gave a lot more teeth to Title VII. The American with Disabilities Act of 1990, we're only going to pay attention to Title I because it's hiring practices. The other titles are housing and those sorts of things. But basically, it forbids discrimination against people with disabilities who are able to perform the essential functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodations. That is a very loaded statement, and that is word for word off of their site. So they had to explain to us what they meant. Individuals with disabilities. What does that mean? You know, I broke my toe and I'm on crutches. Am I disabled? Okay. What it means for ADA. Person with physical or mental impairment that substantially affects one or more major life activities. You can Google the whole list of major life activities, but it's things like the ability to walk, see, talk, think. If you think of something that you do every day, that's a major life activity, usually. The essential functions was another area that we're like, well, what do you mean by essential functions? Job duties that each person in a certain position must do to be an effective employee. So, if you think about a professor, and then you think about the physical requirements of a professor, they must be able to sit for long periods of time. They must be able to stand. They must be able to think. They must be able to deliver a lecture. They must be able to read. They must be able to, there's a lot of things. Now, a couple of the things I said there, must be able to sit for long periods of time. Must be able to stand for long periods of time. Neither one of those are actually required, because I could do my whole entire job from a wheelchair. I could do my whole entire job standing up. Neither are actually required, because the physical limitation of being a professor, there isn't really one. You know, you need to be able to speak, so that would be a physical limitation. You definitely cannot have cognitive impairments to be a college professor. That is an essential function. We're hired for our brains. So an essential function would be the ability to deliver a lecture in some format or another, read, do those sorts of things. So the ADA would not protect somebody with Down syndrome applying to be a college professor because they wouldn't be able to complete the essential functions of the role. And the last one that you really need to understand is reasonable accommodations. Actions taken to accommodate known disabilities. You cannot sue me that I didn't put in a wheelchair ramp if you never told me you had a disability that made it hard to walk upstairs. You have to tell somebody in a management or leadership position about your disability so they can make accommodations. Now, the reason they don't caveat this with like a less than $5,000 or $100,000 are, it depends on the company and the situation. If you're a small company, mom and dad, and you want to hire somebody that needs a $10,000 building accommodation for them to be able to work there, that may or may not be reasonable for that company. It could bankrupt them to have to put that in. Whereas a Johnson Controls that has revenues in the hundreds of billions of dollars, $10,000 is a reasonable accommodation for that company. So you have to tell your employer what your disability is so they can accommodate it. And then there's a decision made on what's reasonable. For example, I'm telling you I want a lift. I'm in a wheelchair. I want a mechanical lift that gets me from the ground floor to the first floor. There's 5 steps that I can't get up, and I want a mechanical lift. The company could come back with, well, we can't afford a mechanical lift, but we put in a ramp. That's a reasonable accommodation. Even though I asked for a lift where all I had to do was push a button, it would bring me up, and you give me a ramp where now I have to wheel my chair up a ramp, that is a reasonable accommodation. The employee and the employer can come to an arrangement if what's being asked for can't be done. That is ADA compliance. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission are who were created by our Title VII law, and they process our complaints. It takes roughly 180 days for them to decide if you were discriminated against. And if you try to sue your employer and you do not have one of these investigations that says you were discriminated against, most lawyers will not represent you. If they say that they will and they don't mention bringing this up, then they're just trying to take money from you. It really is a required sort of letter in these findings. The EEOC will also try to negotiate settlements outside of court so they don't have to go to trial and bog down the courts. What if they did this? What if they did this? Remediation, negotiation, and they try to do that. The other thing they do is litigation. So the EEOC is actually who sued Walmart for not promoting women. There were so many complaints on the same issue that they sued them. They sometimes will also issue a right to sue letter, and that's how you get class action suits. The other main 2 processes or 2 ideas the EEOC is in charge of is they're the folks that are giving you those posters in the break room telling you can't be discriminated against that are legally required to be posted in all employment opportunities. They also do information gathering and sharing. So they're the folks that are calling our HR office and asking how many women, how many men, how many of this race and that race, and what are the ages? And they're sharing that information with the Bureau of Labor Statistics to get a full picture of the hiring demographics per job, per trend, per state. It's really interesting the way they'll break down that data. So that's what the EEOC does on a daily basis. So this week, week 1, we have 3 discussion questions due. All of them are due Wednesday by the end of the night. And the first one is, hopefully you've already done this or you're doing this today, the introductions. Who are you? What do you know about HR? These are the big 2 caveats. I also give you instructions on how to post your picture so we can put a face to the name. There are instructions. I do not want gigantic pictures that we have to scroll right and left to see your eyebrow. And so try to make sure that you size it correctly so we can see you in a nice little thumbnail. The second one is HR trends and policies. There is a specific question on trends and policies. I gave you a couple. I would love for you to do research and find some more, or maybe find another point of view on one of the trends I talked about, because there are various points of view on all of them. And then the third discussion for the week is the laws and regulations. As I discussed in this presentation, there are national laws, there are state laws, there are industry laws, and then there are regulations in all three of those levels that aren't legally required, but they're may as well be legally required. So you need to look at some of those and answer the specific question in the discussion thread. And these are your week 1 deliverables and lecture. If you have any questions, please reach out to me.